The mist clings to the mountainside like a burial shroud, refusing to lift even as the morning sun struggles through the canopy of ancient oaks and maples. Detective Sarah Chen pulls her jacket tighter as she stands at the edge of what locals still call Devil's Backbone Trail, though the official maps renamed it years ago. The October air carries the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something that makes her think of old secrets and older graves. She's driven 4 hours from Richmond to reach this remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains, following a lead that should have died with the century it was born in. Yesterday's phone call changed everything. A construction crew breaking ground for a new resort had found something that shouldn't exist. 11 sets of remains, arranged in a perfect circle, wearing clothes that carbon dating placed at 1897. The same year, 11 children disappeared without a trace from the mountain town of Willowbrook. Sarah checks her phone one last time before the signal disappears entirely. No messages from her partner back in the city, no urgent cases pulling her away from what might be the oldest cold case in Virginia history. She pockets the device and begins the ascent, along a path that hasn't seen official maintenance in decades. The trail winds upward, through groves of mountain laurel and rhododendron, their twisted branches creating a natural tunnel that blocks most of the daylight. Every few hundred yards, she stops to photograph the terrain, noting the way the path forks and rejoins itself like a river delta in reverse. According to the historical records she'd studied on the drive up, this is exactly where the search parties lost the children's trail in 1897. The deeper she ventures into the forest, the more she notices subtle signs that something isn't quite right. Trees that have grown around old scars, as if something had carved symbols into their bark decades ago. Patches of ground where nothing grows, despite the rich soil and abundant rainfall. A heaviness in the air that seems to press against her chest with each breath. 40 minutes into her hike, Sarah reaches the first landmark mentioned in the original police reports, a distinctive rock formation the locals called the Witch's Throne. The boulder sits 20 feet off the main trail, balanced precariously on 2 smaller stones in a way that defies natural explanation. Initials and dates carved into its surface tell the story of a century's worth of visitors, but she's looking for something specific. There, near the base, barely visible beneath a coating of lichen and moss, E.M. 1897, Eliza Morrison, age 9, the youngest of the 11 children who vanished that autumn morning, while on what should have been a simple day hike with their Sunday school teacher. Sarah photographs the carving from multiple angles, noting how the letters seem deeper than the surrounding graffiti, as if whoever carved them had pressed with unusual force or desperation. She consults the hand-drawn map she'd photocopied from the County Historical Society's archives. According to the original search records, this was the last confirmed location where the children had been seen. A local hunter named Thomas Henley had encountered them here around noon, sharing his lunch and warning them about storm clouds gathering to the west. By evening, when the children failed to return to Willowbrook, their families organized search parties that would comb these mountains for 3 weeks. They found scattered pieces of clothing, a few lunch pails, and 1 small boot belonging to 7-year-old Peter Ashford. But no children, no bodies, no answers. The official investigation concluded that the children had become lost in an early blizzard that struck the region that night, their remains presumably scattered by wildlife across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The case was closed in 1898, filed away with dozens of other mountain disappearances that marked the harsh realities of Appalachian life. Sarah follows the trail another half-mile before it begins to descend toward Willowbrook Creek. The sound of running water grows louder with each step, and she notices how the temperature seems to drop the closer she gets to the valley floor. The trees here are older, their trunks massive and scarred by decades of storms. Spanish moss hangs from the branches like tattered curtains, and somewhere in the distance, a crow calls out a warning that echoes off the mountainsides. The creek appears suddenly, a ribbon of dark water cutting through a narrow gorge lined with granite boulders. Sarah checks her GPS coordinates against the construction site manager's directions, then follows the water downstream for another quarter mile until she reaches the yellow tape marking the discovery site. The excavation area sits on a natural plateau overlooking the creek, surrounded by a grove of ancient hemlocks that tower overhead, like cathedral spires. Orange construction cones mark the perimeter, and a white forensics tent covers the actual dig site. Dr. Marcus Webb, the state forensic anthropologist, emerges from the tent as Sarah approaches, pulling off latex gloves and shaking his head. "Detective Chen? I'm Dr. Webb. Thanks for making the drive." He's a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair, and the kind of deep tan that comes from years of outdoor excavation work. But there's something in his expression that speaks of unease, a tension around his eyes that suggests this case has shaken his professional composure. I have to tell you, in 30 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything quite like what we've got here. Sarah follows him toward the tent, noting the way he glances back at the tree line as if expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. "The construction foreman said you found 11 skeletons arranged in a circle?" "That's just the beginning." Webb holds the tent flap open for her. "Take a look at this, and tell me what you think." Inside the tent, powerful work lights illuminate the excavation site like an operating theater. The soil has been carefully removed in layers, revealing a perfect circle of human remains approximately 12 feet in diameter. Each skeleton lies on its back, arms folded across the chest, facing inward toward the center of the circle, where a single large stone sits like an altar. But it's not the arrangement that makes Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It's the preservation. After more than a century in mountain soil, the bones should be scattered fragments, if they exist at all. Instead, each skeleton is complete and articulated, as if the children had simply laid down to sleep and never awakened. Scraps of fabric still cling to the ribs and limbs: calico dresses, wool knickers, cotton shirts, the colors faded but recognizable. Small personal items rest beside each body: a wooden toy horse, a brass thimble, a child's prayer book with pages that should have rotted away decades ago. How is this possible? Sarah kneels beside the nearest skeleton, a small form that couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. A brass button bearing the image of a sailing ship still fastens the remains of a jacket collar. That's what we're trying to figure out. Webb moves to the center of the circle, careful not to disturb the remains. The soil composition here is unusual. Extremely high acidity, low oxygen content. Under the right conditions, that can slow decomposition significantly. But this level of preservation? After 127 years? It shouldn't be possible. Sarah stands and slowly walks the perimeter of the circle, studying each set of remains. 11 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, all positioned identically. No signs of trauma on the bones. No indication of struggle or violence. Just an orderly, almost ceremonial arrangement that raises more questions than it answers. "Have you been able to identify any of them?" she asks. Webb nods toward a folding table set up outside the circle, where evidence bags contain personal effects recovered from the site. "We've got several items that match the original missing persons reports. Silver locket engraved with Elizabeth Hartwell, a pocket watch belonging to Thomas Morrison, Jr., and this. It's up a small leather-bound book, its pages brown with age, but still legible. It's a diary kept by Rebecca Santos, age 13. The last entry is dated October 15, 1897, the day they disappeared. Sarah takes the evidence bag and examines the diary through the plastic. The handwriting is careful and precise, the ink faded to brown but still readable. She flips through several pages, noting entries about school lessons and family chores. But the tone changes in the final weeks, becoming increasingly anxious and fearful. The final entry consists of only 3 lines. "The teacher says we must stay together no matter what happens. The shadows are moving wrong. I can hear them calling our names." "The teacher?" Sarah looks up from the diary. According to the historical records, their Sunday school teacher was Martha Blackwood. She was found 3 days after the children disappeared, wandering in a cornfield 15 miles away with no memory of what happened. That's right. She claimed the last thing she remembered was leading the children up the trail for their nature hike. Everything after that was blank, until she woke up in that field. Webb begins packing the evidence bags into a secure container. The local sheriff at the time thought she'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown from the trauma of losing the children. The sound of footsteps on gravel draws their attention to the edge of the excavation area, where a woman in her 70s approaches through the trees. She moves with the careful gait of someone navigating familiar but treacherous terrain. using a walking stick to test each step on the uneven ground. There's something purposeful about her approach, as if she's been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Dr. Webb." The woman calls out as she reaches the perimeter tape. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood. I believe you've been trying to reach me." Webb hurries over to meet her, and Sarah notices the way his expression changes, surprise mixed with something that might be relief. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for coming. We weren't sure you'd gotten our message." "Oh, I got it all right." Eleanor Blackwood's voice carries the mountain accent that marks her as a local, but there's an educated precision to her words that suggests years of schooling beyond these hills. Her steel-gray eyes take in the forensics tent, the excavation equipment, the carefully marked perimeter. "I've been expecting this call for 60 years, ever since my grandmother finally told me the truth about what happened to Martha." Sarah joins them at the tape line, studying the older woman's face. High cheekbones and steel-gray eyes suggest strength tempered by years of mountain living. But there's something else in her expression, a weight that speaks of secrets carried too long. "Martha Blackwood was your grandmother?" Sarah asks. "She was. And before you ask, yes, she did remember what happened to those children. She just couldn't tell anyone." Eleanor's gaze moves to the forensics tent, then back to Sarah's face. "There are things in these mountains that don't appear in any official reports, Detective. Things that have been here longer than our families, longer than our towns, longer than our memory of why we should stay away from certain places at certain times." Webb exchanges a glance with Sarah before responding. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you might have some family stories about the disappearance, but we're conducting a scientific investigation here. We need facts, not folklore." Eleanor laughs, but there's no humor in the sound. "Facts? You want facts?" She points her walking stick toward the tent. "Fact. Those children have been perfectly preserved for 127 years in soil that should have turned their bones to dust decades ago. Fact. They're arranged in a pattern that follows the old protection circles our ancestors used before they forgot why such things were necessary. Fact. Every 57 years, something in these mountains wakes up hungry, and someone has to feed it or it feeds itself." The silence that follows is broken only by the sound of water running over stones in the creek below. Sarah feels a chill that has nothing to do with the October air, and when she glances at Webb, she sees her own unease reflected in his expression. "What do you mean, every 57 years? Sarah asks finally. Eleanor's grip tightens on her walking stick. 1840, 11 children from the Cherokee settlement disappeared near this same spot. 1897, the Sunday school class. 1954, a Boy Scout troop camping in the valley. Each time, the bodies were found decades later, perfectly preserved, arranged in the same circle. She pauses, her eyes fixed on the tent. "It's 2024, Detective. Do the math." Sarah's mind races through the implications. If Eleanor is right, if there's a pattern spanning nearly 2 centuries, then the discovery of these remains isn't the end of an old mystery. It's a warning about a new one. "You said someone has to feed it," Sarah says carefully. "What did you mean by that?" "My grandmother figured it out after years of research. Years of talking to the old-timers who remembered stories their grandparents had told them." Eleanor's voice drops to barely above a whisper. "There's something under this mountain. Something that was here before the Cherokee, before the earliest settlers. Every 57 years, it stirs, and it needs to feed." The Cherokee knew this. They had rituals, sacrifices, ways to satisfy it and make it sleep again. "And Martha Blackwood?" Sarah asks. "What was her role in all this?" Eleanor's expression softens slightly. "She was supposed to protect them. Her grandmother had told her the old stories, warned her about the signs to watch for. But she was young, and she thought she was strong enough to fight it." A bitter laugh escapes her lips. "She learned different." The older woman reaches into her jacket and pulls out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. These are Martha's private journals, the ones she kept after 1897. She wrote down everything she could remember, everything her grandmother told her, everything she learned about what lives under this mountain. "I think it's time someone else knew the truth." Sarah takes the envelope, feeling the weight of decades-old paper beneath her fingers. "Why are you telling us this now? Why didn't you come forward before?" "Because 67 years ago, we thought the cycle was broken." After the Boy Scout incident in 1954, some of the old families got together and performed the ritual the Cherokee had used. We thought we'd put it to sleep permanently. Eleanor's eyes grow distant. But you can't kill something that old, something that's part of the mountain itself. You can only delay it, and delays always end. That night, in her motel room, Sarah spreads Eleanor's documents across the small table and begins to read. The journals span nearly 6 decades, beginning in 1898 and ending in 1961, 2 years before Martha Blackwood's death. The handwriting evolves from the careful script of a young woman to the shaky scrawl of someone whose hands have been aged by hard work and harder memories. The early entries are fragmented, filled with half-remembered images and sensations that Martha struggled to put into words. But as the months pass, the writing becomes more focused, more detailed, as if the act of recording her memories helped her recover them. March 15th, 1898. I remember now why Grandmother always said we should avoid the old places during the thin times. She called them the years when the barriers grow weak, when the things that sleep beneath can reach through the cracks in the world. Every 57 years, she said, and I thought it was just superstition until I felt the mountain itself calling to those children. The story that emerges from Martha's journals is both horrifying and strangely logical. A pattern of predation that spans centuries, hidden beneath layers of folklore and superstition that most people dismiss as primitive ignorance. According to Martha's research, the entity beneath the mountain is something far older than human civilization in the region. The Cherokee called it the Bone Eater, and their oral histories spoke of rituals performed every 57 years to keep it sleeping. April 22nd, 1900. Grandmother is dying, and she has told me things she should have shared years ago. The Cherokee ritual required a willing sacrifice, someone who understood the nature of the thing and chose to give their life to protect others. It had to be an adult, someone whose life force was strong enough to satisfy the hunger for another cycle. When the ritual stopped, the entity had to feed on quantity instead of quality, 11 children instead of 1 adult. When white settlers displaced the Cherokee in the early 1800s, those rituals stopped, and the entity was forced to hunt for itself. Martha had spent decades tracking down survivors of other incidents, recording their stories and looking for patterns that might help her understand what she'd encountered on the mountain. The final document in Eleanor's envelope is a letter addressed to whoever finds these records and dated just 3 months before Martha's death in 1963. By the time you read this, I will be gone, and the burden of keeping watch will have passed to someone else. The entity beneath the mountain is real, and it is patient, and it is hungry. When 2011 comes, 57 years after the Boy Scout incident, the entity will wake fully. 11 children will disappear unless someone makes the willing sacrifice that the Cherokee understood was necessary. Sarah sets the letter down and stares out the window at the mountains rising like dark sentinels against the dawn sky. According to Martha's timeline, the entity should have awakened in 2011, 13 years ago. But there were no reports of mass disappearances in the area that year. The next morning, she meets Webb at the Willowbrook Library, a small brick building that shares space with the town's historical society. Webb has spent the night going through state archives, and his findings paint a disturbing picture that confirms Eleanor's story. What Eleanor told us yesterday checks out, at least partially. He says, spreading documents across a research table. There were disappearances in 1840, 1897, and 1954, all in the same general area. But there's more. He points to a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1840. Cherokee settlement mourns lost children. 11 children between the ages of 5 and 14 disappeared during a gathering to honor their ancestors. The bodies were never found, and the Cherokee elders claimed the children had been called home by the old spirits. Sarah studies the article, noting the familiar pattern. Same number of children, same age range, same lack of physical evidence. Exactly. And here's the 1954 incident. Webb slides another clipping across the table. 3 Boy Scouts found after week-long search. According to this article, the boys were discovered in good health, but claimed to have no memory of where they'd been or how they'd survived. But it's the most recent document that catches Sarah's attention. In 2011, exactly 57 years after 1954, there was another incident. A family camping group, parents and children from 3 families visiting the area for a reunion. 11 people total, ranging in age from 6 to 62. What happened to them? According to the police report, they were found after 4 days of searching, all sitting in a circle around their cold campfire. Alive, but completely catatonic. They were hospitalized for 2 weeks, and when they finally started speaking again, none of them had any memory of the missing time. Sarah feels a chill run down her spine. Someone performed the ritual in 2011, someone who knew what was happening and had the knowledge to stop it. That's what I think, too. But there's something else. Webb pulls out the most recent document, a death certificate dated just 6 months ago. Eleanor Blackwood's cousin, Margaret Henley, died in March 2024. According to her obituary, she was the town's unofficial historian and the keeper of local traditions and folklore. The implication hangs in the air between them. If Margaret Henley had been the one to perform the 2011 ritual, and if she died 6 months ago, then the knowledge of how to stop the entity might have died with her. When they try to contact Eleanor again, they discover she's vanished. Her house stands empty with a for sale sign in the front yard. The neighbor, an elderly man working in his garden, tells them she packed up and left town 3 days ago, exactly when the construction crew discovered the children's remains. Said she had business to take care of up north, he explains. Didn't say when she'd be back, if ever. Eleanor always was a private sort, especially after her cousin Margaret passed. As they drive back toward the town center, Sarah's phone rings. The caller ID shows a local number she doesn't recognize. Detective Chen? This is Officer Randy Morrison with the Willowbrook Police Department. We've got a situation up on Devil's Backbone Trail that I think you and Dr. Webb need to see. 20 minutes later, they're following Officer Morrison back up the mountain trail, this time accompanied by 2 other local police officers and a paramedic team. The young officer explains the situation as they hike. Early that morning, a group of hikers had called 911 to report finding a woman seated alone near the construction site, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language and apparently oblivious to her surroundings. When they reach the excavation site, Sarah immediately recognizes the figure seated on a fallen log near the edge of the plateau. Eleanor Blackwood sits with her back to the forensics tent, her lips moving in what sounds like a continuous chant or prayer. She's placed objects around herself in a pattern that reminds Sarah uncomfortably of the circle of children's remains. Stones, feathers, what looks like bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread. Mrs. Blackwood? Sarah approaches slowly, her hands visible and empty. Eleanor, it's Detective Chen. We spoke yesterday. Eleanor's chanting stops, and she turns to face Sarah with eyes that seem to look through her rather than at her. There's a quality to her gaze that suggests she's seeing something beyond the physical world, something that exists in the space between present reality and ancient memory. Detective, you read the journals. It's not a question, and Sarah nods. I did. I understand what you're trying to do here. Do you? Eleanor's voice is calm, but there's an underlying tension that suggests she's barely maintaining control. Do you understand that in 6 hours, when the sun sets on the anniversary of their deaths, this mountain will wake up hungry? Do you understand that 11 children will hear their names called in the wind tonight, and they'll follow those voices into the forest? Sarah glances back at Webb and the police officers, then kneels down so she's at Eleanor's eye level. Margaret performed the ritual in 2011, didn't she? She bought you 13 more years to find another solution. Eleanor laughs, but the sound is hollow and bitter. 13 years of searching, of trying to find some other way. Margaret and I contacted every expert we could find. Archaeologists, anthropologists, practitioners of the old religions. We even tried to reach out to the Cherokee Nation, but the records of the original rituals were lost when their people were forced west. So what are you doing now? Eleanor gestures to the objects arranged around her. The only thing left to do. Margaret taught me the words before she died, made me promise that if we couldn't find another way, I would take her place when the time came. Her eyes focus on Sarah with sudden intensity. Someone has to make the willing sacrifice, Detective. Someone who understands what they're facing and chooses to feed the hunger rather than let it feed itself. The implications of Eleanor's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The older woman isn't trying to perform some protective ritual or banishment ceremony. She's planning to offer herself as a sacrifice to save 11 children she's never met. There has to be another way, Sarah says desperately. The 1954 ritual worked without human sacrifice. Margaret found a way to modify it in 2011. Temporary measures. Eleanor's voice rises to nearly a shout, then drops back to a whisper. Borrowed time that costs more with each cycle. The entity grows stronger, hungrier, more demanding. The stopgap solutions work for shorter periods each time. Margaret's ritual in 2011 should have bought us 57 years, but it only gave us 13. The next modification might only work for 5 years, or 1, or not at all. Officer Morrison speaks up from where he's been standing guard at the tree line. My grandfather used to talk about the old cave systems in this part of the mountain, said the Cherokee considered some of them sacred, off-limits to anyone but their medicine men. There's one about 2 miles north of here that's been sealed off since the 1960s, after some college kids got lost in it. Eleanor's head snaps up at this information, her eyes suddenly bright with hope. Sealed how? By whom? County government, I think, put up a steel grate and posted warning signs after the rescue. But local kids still sometimes break in there. My nephew Tommy went in there about 5 years ago with some friends. Came out talking about walls covered in symbols and what looked like ceremonial chambers deep in the mountain. Sarah feels a spark of hope. Have any of these kids ever reported finding anything unusual in the cave? Paintings, carvings, anything that might be remnants of Cherokee rituals? Actually, yeah. Tommy said there were paintings that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them, and chambers that echoed with voices, even when no one was speaking. His parents grounded him for a month and made him promise never to go back. Eleanor rises from her position near the ritual objects, her movements sharp, with sudden purpose. The heart of the mountain. Margaret and I always suspected there had to be a central location, a place where the entity was anchored to the physical world. If the Cherokee built their ceremonial chambers around it. She trails off, but Sarah can see the implication in her expression. You think we might find more detailed instructions for the ritual? Sarah asks. More than that. Eleanor's eyes are bright with possibility. The Cherokee didn't just perform sacrificial rituals. They had binding ceremonies, ways of constraining spirits, and forcing them into permanent sleep. If those records still exist, if they survived in the cave, there might be a way to end the cycle permanently, without requiring anyone to die. Morrison gets through to his nephew. After a brief conversation, he turns back to the group. Tommy can meet us at the cave entrance in an hour. He says the steel grate is rusted enough that it can be pried open without too much trouble. But he wants to know why we're asking, and he's not comfortable going in there without a damn good reason. Sarah makes a decision that she knows her superiors would never approve. Tell him we're investigating the children's disappearances, and we have reason to believe the cave contains evidence relevant to the case. That's technically true, even if it's not the whole truth. They organize quickly, with Eleanor gathering her ritual objects and packing them into a canvas bag. Tommy Morrison meets them at the cave entrance, a lanky young man with the kind of deep tan and calloused hands that mark him as someone who works outdoors. He's brought bolt cutters and heavy-duty flashlights, along with a coil of rope and what looks like climbing gear. Uncle Randy said your cops investigating those missing kids from way back? Tommy's voice carries the skeptical tone of someone who spent too much time being told that his experiences weren't real. Because I gotta tell you, there's stuff in that cave that's not gonna show up in any police report. The cave entrance itself is a narrow opening in the mountainside, partially concealed by overhanging rock and thick vegetation. The steel grate blocking access is indeed heavily rusted, and Tommy makes quick work of cutting through several bars to create an opening large enough for a person to squeeze through. Eleanor distributes protective items, small mirrors tied with red thread, iron nails, and vials of what she claims is water taken from a mountain spring during the new moon. Stay together, she instructs as Tommy leads them into the darkness beyond the grate. Don't touch any symbols or carvings you might see, and don't respond if you hear voices calling your name. The entity will try to separate us, to pick us off one by one. Our only protection is in numbers and purpose. The cave tunnel slopes downward at a steep angle. requiring careful footing on stone worn smooth by centuries of water flow. Their flashlight beams reveal walls of limestone carved with what appear to be natural formations, but which, upon closer inspection, show clear signs of human modification. Symbols that might be Cherokee pictographs alternate with geometric patterns that seem to shift and flow in peripheral vision. After 20 minutes of descent, the tunnel opens into a large chamber filled with the sound of dripping water and something else, a low humming that seems to come from the stone itself. Tommy's flashlight sweeps across walls covered in elaborate paintings that depict human figures arranged in circles around what appears to be a great serpent or dragon emerging from the earth. "This is where it starts," Tommy says, his voice barely above a whisper. "The first ceremonial chamber. But there are deeper levels, places where the paintings tell different stories." Sarah approaches one of the wall paintings, careful not to touch the surface. The pigments are remarkably well preserved, protected by the cave's constant temperature and humidity. The human figures in the painting are clearly engaged in some kind of ritual, their arms raised toward the serpentine creature that dominates the composition. Eleanor studies the Cherokee text carefully. "Some of it. This appears to be a creation story, but not one I'm familiar with. It suggests that the entity, the serpent, was here before the Cherokee, that it was part of the mountains formation." She pauses, following the progression of paintings around the chamber. But here, in this sequence, the Cherokee aren't worshipping it, they're binding it. They follow Tommy deeper into the cave system, through passages that branch and intersect in patterns that seem designed to confuse intruders. Several times, Sarah is certain they're walking in circles, but Tommy navigates with the confidence of someone who has memorized every turn and landmark. The humming grows stronger with each level they descend, and Sarah finds herself struggling to maintain focus. The sound seems to interfere with her ability to think clearly, creating a dreamlike state where memories and imagination blur together. The final chamber is vast, its ceiling lost in darkness beyond the reach of their flashlights. The walls are covered in paintings that span from floor to darkness above, depicting what appears to be the complete history of the entity's relationship with human civilizations. Sarah can see sequences showing various indigenous peoples, early European settlers, and even what might be modern scenes of children disappearing into forests. But it's the altar at the center of the chamber that draws their attention. Unlike the simple stone platforms in the upper levels, this is an elaborate construction of carved stone that seems to pulse with its own inner light. Symbols cover every surface, some recognizable as Cherokee pictographs, others completely alien. Tommy approaches the altar cautiously, his flashlight beam revealing additional details carved into its base. There's more text here, but it's different from the Cherokee symbols. Older, maybe? Eleanor joins him, studying the carvings with growing excitement. "These are pre-Cherokee." Some of the symbols match artifacts that archaeologists have found at sites dating back thousands of years. She runs her finger just above the surface of the stone, careful not to make contact. This might be instructions from whoever was here first, whoever discovered the entity and learned how to control it. As she translates what she can understand, a different picture begins to emerge. The entity isn't native to the mountain. It's something that was bound here in ancient times, imprisoned by people whose names and faces have been lost to history. The Cherokee inherited the responsibility of keeping it contained, but they didn't create the original binding. According to this, Eleanor says, her voice growing more confident as she pieces together the meaning, the entity can be returned to its original prison, but only if the binding is renewed using the exact methods of the first containment. It requires... She pauses, studying a particularly complex section of carvings. It requires the willing participation of someone from each family line that has been touched by the entity's hunger. Sarah feels a chill that has nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Each family line? How many families are we talking about? Eleanor continues reading, her expression growing more troubled with each symbol she translates. 11 family lines. The Cherokee who first performed the sacrifice, the settlers who lost children in 1840, the families from 1897, 1954, 2011. She looks up at Sarah. It requires representatives from 11 specific bloodlines, all performing the ritual together. But there's an alternative method carved into the altar. Eleanor studies another section, her expression shifting from despair to cautious hope. There's something else here. An alternative method. If the family representatives cannot be gathered, the binding can be renewed by someone who carries the blood of all 11 lines. Someone who's descended from families affected by multiple cycles? Is that even possible? In a small mountain community where families have intermarried for generations, it's not just possible, it's probable. Eleanor's voice grows stronger as she continues reading. The original inhabitants of this area were a small, interconnected population. Cherokee, early settlers, later immigrants. They all married within the community. Someone alive today almost certainly carries genetic heritage from multiple affected families. How do we identify that person? Webb asks. We don't need to. Eleanor's face is pale in the flashlight beam, but her voice is steady. I spent 60 years researching my family genealogy, tracing connections to every disappearance incident in the area. Margaret and I both carried blood from at least 8 of the 11 family lines. When she died, that heritage passed to me. The terrible logic of Eleanor's discovery settles over the group like a shroud. She didn't come to the mountain to perform a simple sacrifice. She came because she's genetically qualified to renew the ancient binding, to lock the entity away permanently, using her own life as the key. Tommy has been silent during this exchange, but now he speaks up from where he's standing near the chamber entrance. We need to make a decision fast. The humming is getting stronger, and I'm starting to hear voices in it. If we stay here much longer, we might not be able to leave at all. Sarah realizes that he's right. The sound that has been a background presence throughout their exploration is now clearly recognizable as voices. Children's voices, calling names and pleading for help. The entity is waking up, reaching out through the cave system to draw them deeper into its influence. Eleanor, if you perform this binding ritual, what exactly happens to you? She asks. According to the carvings, my life force becomes part of the binding itself. I don't just die. I become the lock that keeps the entity imprisoned. Eleanor's voice is calm, but Sarah can see the fear in her eyes. It's not death as we understand it. It's transformation into something that exists solely to contain what should never be free. The ethical implications are staggering. Sarah is being asked to allow, or even assist, a woman to sacrifice herself for the theoretical protection of unknown future victims. Every instinct she has as a law enforcement officer rebels against the idea, but the investigative part of her mind recognizes the logic of Eleanor's solution. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone suddenly buzzes with an incoming call. The display shows Willowbrook PD, and when she answers, Officer Morrison's voice crackles through heavy static. Detective Chen, we've got a situation in town. Multiple reports of children sleepwalking, all heading toward the mountain trail. Parents are finding empty beds and open doors. We've got search teams forming, but the signal cuts out, leaving only silence. Sarah tries calling back, but her phone shows no signal. Whatever influence the entity exerts over the area is apparently growing stronger as sunset approaches. It's beginning, Eleanor says simply. The children are hearing their names called. By the time they reach the forest, they'll be completely under the entity's control. She looks around the chamber, taking in the ancient paintings and carvings that have waited centuries for this moment. This is where it ends, either with my sacrifice and permanent binding, or with 11 children joining the entity in its hunger. Sarah makes a decision that she knows will haunt her regardless of the outcome. What do you need from us? Eleanor indicates specific positions around the altar where Webb, Sarah, and Tommy should stand. The ritual requires witnesses, people who understand what's happening and choose to bear witness to the binding. You don't participate directly, but your presence helps anchor the ceremony to the physical world. As they take their positions, Eleanor begins the ritual preparation, following instructions carved into the altar stone. She lights candles made from mountain laurel wax, burns herbs that fill the chamber with smoke that seems to move independently of air currents, and begins chanting in what sounds like a mixture of Cherokee and something much older. The humming sound grows louder in response, and Sarah can now clearly distinguish individual voices within it. Children calling for their mothers, pleading for help, crying in languages she doesn't recognize. The entity is using the voices of every child it has ever taken, creating a chorus of hunger and loss that resonates through the mountain itself. Eleanor's chanting becomes more intense, her voice rising to match the entity's growing presence. The symbols carved into the altar begin to glow with a cold light that has nothing to do with their candles, and Sarah feels a pressure building in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. It's fighting the binding. Eleanor calls out over the increasing noise. It knows what I'm trying to do, and it's calling for help. Stay in your positions no matter what you see or hear. If the witness circle is broken, the ritual fails. The chamber fills with shadows that move independently of their light sources, and Sarah begins to see shapes forming in the darkness. The outlines of children, dozens of them, all reaching toward Eleanor with expressions of desperate hunger. These are the victims the entity has claimed over the centuries, bound to it by their deaths and transformed into extensions of its will. But there are other figures, too, adult forms that seem to be fighting against the shadows, pushing back against the entity's influence. Sarah recognizes some of them from the historical photographs she's studied. Martha Blackwood, Margaret Henley, and others who dedicated their lives to understanding and containing the threat. Eleanor's voice rises to a shout as she completes the first phase of the ritual, and the pressure in the chamber becomes almost unbearable. Sarah's ears pop, and she tastes copper in her mouth as if the air itself is becoming toxic. The entity is trying to break free completely. Eleanor gasps between chanted verses. It knows this is its last chance to escape permanent binding. Hold your positions. We're almost through the first barrier. The shadows around them coalesce into more solid forms, and Sarah finds herself face to face with the entity itself, a serpentine shape as tall as the chamber ceiling, with eyes like black holes and a mouth that opens onto endless darkness. It speaks in the voices of every child it has ever taken, promising Eleanor anything she desires if she'll only step away from the altar and let it feed. But Eleanor continues the ritual, her voice growing stronger rather than weaker as the entity's presence intensifies. The symbols on the altar pulse with increasing brightness, and Sarah realizes that the carved stone isn't just recording the binding ceremony, it's actively participating in it, channeling power that was placed here thousands of years ago by the original prisoners. The second barrier is opening. Eleanor calls out, and Sarah can see tears streaming down the older woman's face. I can feel the entity's hunger, its rage at being contained. But I can also feel the strength of everyone who came before, everyone who sacrificed to keep it locked away. The entity's form begins to waver and distort, pulled between its desire to escape and the power of the renewed binding. For a moment, Sarah thinks they've succeeded. The creature seems to be dissolving back into shadow and mist. Then Tommy screams. Sarah spins toward him and sees that he's no longer standing in his assigned position. Something has grabbed him from behind. Not the entity itself, but one of the shadow children it controls. The small figure is pulling Tommy toward the chamber entrance, trying to break the witness circle and disrupt the ritual. Without thinking, Sarah lunges toward Tommy, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward the altar. The shadow child hisses and releases him, but the damage is done. The witness circle has been broken, and the binding ritual falters. Eleanor's chanting stutters and stops as the power building around the altar dissipates. The entity's form solidifies again, more real and threatening than before, and its laughter echoes through the chamber like breaking glass. "We failed," Eleanor whispers, collapsing to her knees beside the altar. "The binding is broken and I don't have the strength to start over. The entity is free to complete its awakening." As if summoned by her words, Sarah's phone suddenly receives a burst of text messages as it reconnects to the cellular network. Each one is from a different number, but they all contain the same message, children's names and ages, followed by the words, "walking toward the mountain." 11 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, have left their homes and are making their way through the darkness toward Devil's Backbone Trail. The pattern that began nearly 2 centuries ago is about to complete itself once more. But as Sarah reads the messages, she notices something that Eleanor missed in her despair. The ritual didn't completely fail. It damaged the entity's hold on the physical world, weakening its ability to maintain the children's compulsion from a distance. "Eleanor, look at the timestamps on these messages," Sarah says urgently. "The children started walking 20 minutes ago, but they're moving slowly, stopping frequently. The entity's call isn't as strong as it should be. Eleanor raises her head, studying the messages with growing hope. The partial binding, it worked partially. The entity is injured, weakened. It can still call the children, but it can't fully control them until they reach the cave. How long do we have? Webb asks. Eleanor checks the altar symbols, which are still glowing faintly despite the ritual's interruption. The children will reach the trail entrance in about 2 hours, but they'll move even more slowly once they enter the forest. The entity's influence is weaker there because of the protective barriers the Cherokee established centuries ago. We might have until dawn. Dawn to do what? Tommy asks, still shaken from his encounter with the shadow child. Eleanor struggles to her feet, her movements slow and painful, as if the interrupted ritual has aged her years in minutes. To try again, but next time, we need to be prepared for the entity's countermeasures. It knows our plan now, and it will do everything possible to prevent the binding from succeeding. The climb back to the surface passes in tense silence, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts about what they've witnessed and what they still need to do. The cave's humming has decreased in intensity, but it hasn't stopped completely, and Sarah can still hear faint voices calling names that belong to children walking through the darkness toward their doom. When they emerge from the cave, the sun has set completely, and the mountain is shrouded in the kind of deep darkness that only exists far from city lights. Sarah's phone shows 11 missed calls from various law enforcement agencies, all reporting the same phenomenon. Children in Willowbrook and the surrounding area have begun sleepwalking toward the mountains, and efforts to wake them or redirect them have been unsuccessful. But as they reach the parking area, they discover that they're not alone. Cars and pickup trucks line the mountain road. Dozens of vehicles belonging to families whose children are walking through the night. Parents and siblings have followed the sleepwalking kids as far as they can, but something prevents them from going farther up the trail. Sarah approaches a group of adults standing near the trailhead, recognizing some faces from the newspaper photographs she studied. These are descendants of the families affected by previous disappearances, drawn back to the mountain by the same force that calls their children. Detective Chen, a woman in her 40s, steps forward, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. I'm Susan Hartwell. My daughter Emma is one of the missing children. The police said you're investigating what happened here before. Sarah looks around at the gathered families, men and women whose bloodlines stretch back through generations of mountain communities, whose ancestors have dealt with this entity for nearly 2 centuries. An idea begins forming in her mind, one that might offer an alternative to Eleanor's solitary sacrifice. Mrs. Hartwell, how much do you know about your family's history in this area? Specifically about what happened to children who shared your name in 1897. The woman's expression shifts from confusion to recognition. Elizabeth Hartwell. She was my great-great-grandmother's sister. She disappeared with 10 other children during a church outing. They never found her body. Sarah turns to address the entire group. How many of you have family connections to the previous disappearances? 1,840, 1897, 1954, 2011? Hands raised slowly as family members recognize the significance of the question. Sarah counts quickly. Representatives from 9 of the 11 bloodlines Eleanor mentioned are standing right here, drawn to the mountain by the same force that called their children. Eleanor approaches, having overheard the conversation. Detective, what are you thinking? You said the binding ritual requires representatives from 11 family lines. What if it doesn't have to be one person, carrying all the bloodlines? What if we can distribute the burden among multiple participants? Eleanor's eyes widen as she grasps the implications. A group ritual instead of an individual sacrifice. The original Cherokee ceremonies often involved multiple participants sharing the spiritual load. She studies the faces of the gathered families. But it would still require life force to power the binding. Not everyone would survive. Susan Hartwell speaks up. Detective, I don't understand everything you're talking about. But if there's a way to save Emma and the other children, I'll do whatever is necessary. Most of these families have lost children to this mountain before. We won't lose them again. Murmurs of agreement ripple through the crowd. Sarah realizes that these families have been living with the legacy of the disappearances for generations, passing down stories and fears that have shaped their entire understanding of the world. They're not just willing to believe in the entity's existence, They've been expecting this night for years. "If we're going to attempt a group ritual, we need to move fast," Eleanor says, checking her watch. "The children will reach the cave entrance in about 90 minutes. Once they are in the entity's direct presence, they'll be beyond our ability to save." They organize quickly, with Eleanor leading the family representatives back toward the cave while Sarah coordinates with local law enforcement to track the children's progress. Officer Morrison reports that the sleepwalking kids are moving in a loose group, staying together despite their individual starting points. "They're about 3 miles out from the trailhead," he reports over the radio, "moving slowly but steadily. We've tried to approach them, but anyone who gets too close falls asleep and starts walking with them. It's like the effect is contagious." Sarah and Webb drive back to the cave with Eleanor and 9 family representatives, leaving Tommy to coordinate with the police and keep track of the children's location. The return journey feels different. The mountain itself seems more alive, more aware of their presence. Trees creak without wind, and shadows move independently of their headlights. At the cave entrance, Eleanor distributes protective charms to each family member, explaining the basic principles of the binding ritual they're about to attempt. "The entity will fight harder this time because it knows we can succeed. It will try to turn us against each other, to make us doubt what we're doing. Remember that everything you see and hear is designed to make you abandon the ritual." The descent into the cave passes more quickly with the larger group, but Sarah notices that the humming sound is much louder than before. The entity is fully awake now, drawing power from the approaching children and preparing for its final feeding. In the deepest chamber, Eleanor arranges the family representatives around the altar, according to bloodline connections, creating a complex pattern that channels the spiritual heritage of each participant into the binding ceremony. Sarah and Webb take positions as witnesses, but this time they're joined by other family members who aren't directly participating in the ritual. "Before we begin," Eleanor addresses the group, her voice echoing in the vast chamber, "you need to understand what we're asking of you. This ritual will permanently bind the entity, but it requires life force to power the binding. Some of you may not survive the ceremony." "How many?" Susan Hartwell asks bluntly. Eleanor's answer is barely audible. "I don't know. The original texts don't specify the cost for group rituals. It could be one person, or it could be all of us." The silence that follows is broken by David Morrison, a middle-aged man Sarah recognizes from the Historical Society. "My son walked out of our house 2 hours ago with his eyes open but his mind somewhere else. If this is the only way to bring him back, then we do it." Agreement echoes around the chamber as each family representative commits to the ritual despite its unknown cost. Sarah finds herself deeply moved by their courage and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for children they may never live to see again. Eleanor begins the ceremony, but this time the chanting involves multiple voices as each participant contributes words in their family's traditional language: Cherokee, Scots Gaelic, German, and others. The altar responds more strongly than before, its symbols blazing with light that illuminates the entire chamber. The entity manifests almost immediately, its serpentine form coiling around the ceiling as it tries to disrupt the ritual through sheer intimidation. But the group holds together, their combined will stronger than Eleanor's individual effort had been. First barrier opening. Eleanor calls out, and Sarah can see the strain on her face as she channels power from all 11 bloodlines simultaneously. The entity is trying to break our connections to each other. Don't let it isolate you. The shadows in the chamber take on more complex forms, not just the entity's previous victims, but manifestations of doubt and fear designed to weaken the participants. Resolve. Sarah sees her own childhood fears given shape, along with nightmares that belong to other members of the group. But the family representatives continue chanting, their voices growing stronger rather than weaker as the entity's presence intensifies. These are people who have lived their entire lives in the shadow of this mountain, who have passed down stories of loss and sacrifice through generations. As the ritual progresses, the entity fights back violently. Its serpentine form lashes out at the participants, passing through their bodies like ice-cold wind but leaving visible wounds, not physical cuts, but spiritual injuries that manifest as pain and weakness. Susan Hartwell cries out as something invisible claws at her chest, but she maintains her position and continues the chant. "It's trying to drain our life force directly," Eleanor gasps. "The binding requires willing sacrifice. but the entity is attempting to take more than we're offering. Hold fast. We're almost through the second barrier. David Morrison collapses to his knees, blood trickling from his nose, but his voice never wavers as he continues speaking the ritual words. Around the chamber, other participants show signs of the entity's assault: pale skin, trembling hands, eyes that reflect an inner struggle between will and exhaustion. The entity is drawing power from the children, Eleanor realizes with growing alarm. They're close enough now that it can use their life force to fight the binding. The sound of children's voices echoes through the cave. Not the distant calling Sarah has been hearing, but actual voices of actual children, growing closer with each passing moment. The 11 sleepwalking kids have reached the cave entrance and are making their way down toward the deepest chamber. Sarah realizes they need to break the entity's connection to the children. She remembers Tommy mentioning that the entity's effect doesn't work on people wearing old iron. Several family representatives are wearing antique jewelry that could qualify. Eleanor makes the decision. Detective Chen, take whoever you can and intercept the children. The rest of us will continue the ritual. If you can break the entity's connection to them before they reach this chamber, the binding should succeed. Sarah identifies the 4 people with protective iron and explains the mission as quickly as possible. The children are maybe 10 minutes away from this chamber. We need to reach them, get protective charms to each one, and break the entity's hold before they can complete their journey here. The team moves quickly through the cave system, following the sound of children's voices echoing through the tunnels. Sarah carries a bag of protective charms prepared by Eleanor, while the others spread out to cover different passages in case the children have become separated. They meet the sleepwalking group in the second ceremonial chamber, where the children stand in a perfect circle around the altar stone. Their eyes are open but unfocused, and they're speaking in unison, not words, but a humming sound that matches the entity's call perfectly. Sarah approaches the nearest child, a girl of perhaps 8, with blonde hair and a nightgown that's been torn by her journey through the forest. The moment Sarah comes within arm's reach, she feels the pull of the entity's compulsion, a voice in her mind urging her to join the circle, to add her life force to the offering. But the iron pendant she's wearing, a Civil War-era locket borrowed from one of the family representatives, seems to create a barrier around the compulsion. She can feel the entity's influence, but she can resist it long enough to press a protective charm into the girl's hand. The effect is immediate. The child blinks, her eyes focusing for the first time since leaving her home, and the humming sound stops as her connection to the entity is severed. She looks around the cave chamber in confusion and terror, but she's no longer under the entity's control. Working quickly, Sarah and her team distribute protective charms to each of the 11 children, breaking their individual connections to the entity one by one. With each severed link, Sarah can feel the entity's rage building. Its power source is being systematically dismantled, just as it's on the verge of breaking free completely. By the time the last child receives a protective charm, the entity's call has stopped completely. The humming sound that has filled the cave since their arrival fades to silence, and Sarah realizes that she can no longer feel the oppressive presence that has been pressing against her mind. "Is it over?" asks the blonde girl, who has identified herself as Emma Hartwell, Susan's daughter. Sarah's radio crackles with Eleanor's voice from the deepest chamber. "The third barrier is sealed. The binding is holding. Return to the chamber. We need all witnesses present for the final phase." They guide the children back to the deepest chamber, where Sarah finds the ritual participants still arranged around the altar but looking exhausted and drained. Eleanor is barely standing, supported by 2 other family members, but her face shows triumph rather than defeat. "The entity is bound," she announces as Sarah's group enters the chamber. "The connection to the children provided the final power we needed to complete the ritual. It's locked away permanently. No more 57-year cycles, no more disappearances." The altar stone, which had been blazing with light throughout the ceremony, now shows only a faint glow from deep within its carved symbols. The entity's presence is gone completely, leaving behind only the natural sounds of water dripping in distant passages. But the cost has been significant. 3 of the ritual participants, David Morrison, an elderly woman named Margaret Chen, and a young man Sarah doesn't recognize, are unconscious and barely breathing. The binding required life force to power it, And these three individuals bore the brunt of that cost. The emergence from the cave feels like stepping into a different world. The oppressive atmosphere that has hung over the mountain for days is gone, replaced by normal October air that carries the scent of leaves and wood smoke rather than ancient hunger. Stars are visible in the clear sky, and the sound of rescue vehicles in the distance speaks of a world that continues to function according to natural laws. The reunion between parents and children takes place in the parking area illuminated by emergency floodlights. Sarah watches as Susan Hartwell embraces her daughter Emma, as other families gather around children they thought they might never see again. The relief and joy are palpable, but they're tempered by concern for the three ritual participants who remain unconscious. Eleanor sits on the tailgate of an ambulance, accepting treatment for exhaustion and minor injuries, while giving her statement to Officer Morrison. She looks decades older than she did that morning, aged by the spiritual effort of channeling power from 11 bloodlines simultaneously. Detective Chen, she calls as Sarah approaches. The binding is complete, but there's one more thing you need to know. The entity is locked away permanently, but the cave system itself is now a sacred site. It must be protected, monitored, treated with the respect due to a place where such significant spiritual work has taken place. As dawn breaks over the Blue Ridge Mountains, Sarah finds herself standing at the edge of a mystery that has been solved but not ended. The immediate threat is over, the children are safe, and the cycle of disappearances has been broken. But the events of the past few days have opened her eyes to possibilities that don't fit into standard police procedures or scientific understanding. Sarah spends the next several hours completing paperwork and coordinating with various agencies about how to officially document what happened. The truth, an ancient entity bound by ritual sacrifice, obviously can't appear in any official report. Instead, she files a case summary describing a complex kidnapping scheme involving multiple perpetrators who used drugs and psychological manipulation to control their victims. It's not entirely false, just incomplete. The children were indeed taken by an external force and held against their will until they were rescued by coordinated law enforcement action. The fact that the force was supernatural rather than human, and that the rescue involved ritual magic rather than conventional tactics, are details that can be omitted without technically lying. The drive back to Richmond takes her along mountain roads that wind through forests now peaceful in the morning sunlight. Sarah finds herself thinking about the children who walk these same paths in darkness, drawn by voices that promised answers to questions they were too young to understand. They're safe now, returned to families who will never fully understand what almost happened to them. But more than that, they're free. Free from a cycle of horror that has claimed lives for nearly 2 centuries. Free from the burden of carrying forward a pattern that should have ended long ago. The binding ritual worked. The entity is contained, and future generations will grow up without the shadow of the mountain's hunger hanging over them. As she reaches the edge of the mountain region and begins the descent toward the Virginia flatlands, Sarah's phone rings with a call from her supervisor in Richmond. There's a new case waiting for her, a series of break-ins that follows a pattern the department hasn't been able to decode. She answers the call and listens to the briefing, already shifting her mind back to the familiar rhythms of conventional police work. But part of her attention remains focused on the rearview mirror, where the Blue Ridge Mountains rise like ancient guardians against the morning sky. The entity sleeps now, bound by the willing sacrifice of people who understood that some threats require solutions that exist outside normal human experience. The cave remains under the protection of families whose bloodlines connect them to centuries of loss and courage. Somewhere in the deepest chamber, an altar stone glows faintly with the light of a binding that will hold, as long as there are people willing to remember why it was necessary. Sarah drives toward Richmond and her next case, carrying with her the knowledge that there are mysteries in the world that can't be solved through evidence and procedure alone. Sometimes justice requires older methods, deeper understanding, and the kind of courage that's willing to pay whatever price the solution demands. In Willowbrook, families go about their daily routines with children who remember nothing of their midnight journey through the forest. Parents hold them a little closer, grateful for a return they don't fully understand. And in a cave deep beneath Devil's Backbone Trail, an ancient hunger sleeps peacefully for the first time in centuries, contained by the willing sacrifice of those who understood that some prices are worth paying. The cycle is broken. The mountain is quiet. And 11 children grow older safely, protected by a binding that will outlast the memory of those who created it.